It's been just over a decade since the United Nations adopted the Canadian-led doctrine known as the responsibility to protect.
Trucks burn at the end of a dirt track in Kaya State, southern Myanmar. After the fires have died down, other videos showed charred bodies in the wreckage.
R2P. It's aimed at avoiding mass atrocities and genocides, and yet the world has since witnessed the terrible toll on civilians in Syria and Libya, to name just two.
Among those missing, 2 workers from the charity Save the Children, who'd been distributing aid to internally displaced people in the area.
So, is R2P still alive, or basically dead?
Hi there, and thanks for listening. If you're enjoying our podcast and have a recommendation about someone you think we should have on to share their voice and journey with the world, by all means, let us know. It could be an aid worker, monastic, author, journalist, scholar, resistance leader, really anyone with some tie or another to the ongoing situation in Myanmar. To offer up a name, go to our website, insightmyanmar.org, and let us know. But for now, just sit back and take a listen to today's episode. I'm here with Liam Scott, who is a research associate at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. And we're going to be speaking about a term that many people in and around Myanmar have been talking about quite some time, R2P. So, Liam, thanks so much for joining us and breaking down this topic for us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about, R2P in Myanmar with you today.
Yeah, so let's start right ahead with the basics. Can you just define for the listeners, what is R2P?
Yeah, so, R2P, or the responsibility to protect, is an international norm that the UN unanimously adopted in 2005, and it really seeks to, protect populations around the world from atrocity crimes, which are genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. So it's this, really a cornerstone of atrocity prevention as this really important, global principle, international norm in preventing atrocities and, preventing people from atrocity crimes.
Right. Thanks for that. And can you tell us the history and context of how the concepts around R2P were developed?
Yeah, so, R2P really was, I kind of view it as being established almost by necessity, kind of in the wake of international failures in responding to atrocities, namely in Rwanda with the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, as well as atrocity crimes in former Yugoslavia. And, R2P was, and it is still, an effort to combat and, that historic or that pattern of international indifference and international inaction to atrocity crimes. And that it really sought to bring an end to that indifference and that inaction that really had characterized the international community's response to atrocity crimes for quite some time. So there are 3 main pillars of the responsibility to protect. And the first pillar is really interesting because it's inward facing. It's internal. It's looking domestically at how countries, how governments can protect their own populations from atrocity crime. So it really says that, every state, every country has a responsibility to protect its populations from these 4 atrocity crimes. And, that's really important because it speaks to this responsibility that all countries have to build, a national resilience to atrocity crimes through a number of different mechanisms, a number of different strategies to protect their own populations from atrocity crimes. And I think when we talk about R2P, we often forget about, that first pillar. It's often talked about in terms of, foreign affairs or how, one country is responding to atrocity crimes or risks of atrocity crimes in another country. But, R2P really starts at home. It starts with building up a country's own ability and capacity to prevent atrocities and to respond to atrocities. But then you get to pillar 2, and that speaks to how, the international community in general has a responsibility to encourage and to work with other countries to help them protect their populations from atrocity crimes, from those 4 atrocity crimes. And then the third pillar is that, if a state is failing to uphold their responsibility to protect, whether it's because of a lack of capacity to protect their people from atrocity crimes, or if it is because, that country is a perpetrator itself of atrocity crimes, or if they're, just unwilling to uphold that responsibility to protect, then the international community has a responsibility to work to protect those people from mass atrocities. And there are, at every level, there are different, things in, what we call the R2P toolbox to, like I said, with pillar 1, with building up, a country's national resilience to preventing atrocities, internally, all the way through, pillars 2 and 3, different strategies for preventing atrocities and for combating ongoing atrocities in that regard.
So you're working at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. Can you tell us a bit about the mission of this organization?
Yeah, so the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect was founded in 2008. So that is, 3 years after the principle was, adopted by the UN. And, our core mission really is to really, institutionalize the responsibility to protect and make the responsibility to protect a reality in the international system. And we do that through monitoring ongoing atrocities or ongoing situations where there is a risk of atrocities. We conduct research on those countries. We we engage in advocacy primarily at the UN level, both in New York at the Security Council, as well as in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, to really encourage states to uphold their responsibility to protect in how they respond to different situations around the world. So we recommend strategies to them. We encourage them to do certain things in their response to different atrocities, or to respond to them in the first place. Working with other and also helping them build their, like I said, going back to pillar 1, helping countries and build their national capacity, that national resilience to atrocity crimes.
Mm-hmm, right. And in your organization's mission statement, it's written, quote, "We also intend to commit ourselves as necessary and appropriate to helping states build capacity to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and to assisting those which are under stress before crisis and conflict breaks out," end quote, similar to what you laid out just now. And these are really powerful words. And now focusing a bit more specifically on Myanmar, can you explain how, in what ways you're proceeding with that mission statement on the ground to Myanmar specifically following the coup?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think if possible, I'd like to give just a little bit more, I think, about context about,
Sure.
Following the coup. What we saw was, obviously there was an unprecedented, unprecedented protests all around the country. And what we saw there was also an unprecedented, level of people really evoking the responsibility to protect as they protested, whether that was on T-shirts, whether that was on signs, whether that was, writing it on roads and things like that. Really this unprecedented level of calling for the international community to uphold their responsibility to protect, because clearly the military was not doing that. And they were calling for, the protection that they deserved under this international principle. And I think that, that really demonstrates an important evolution in the responsibility to protect since it was founded in 2005. It hasn't even been, it's almost 20 years old, this principle. And over the past, since 2005, it's really, opened up. We write about this a lot in a lot of our publications, but it's opened up from, something that has been primarily used by policymakers at the UN or at governments, but really, something that was exclusive to the elite. And it has been, I think it's opened up to something that civil society and even the individual can really evoke and employ. And I think that right after, following the coup is really, really epitomized that with all of these protesters evoking and calling for R2P. So I just wanted to, I think that's really important context, just to kind of, as we think about R2P in Myanmar, that, Myanmar's people have been calling for it, since the coup. And I think that's really important. But in terms of main things that, what falls under R2P when it comes to Myanmar and what we want the international response to Myanmar to look like. There are a bunch of things that we've been calling for and that we've been advocating for, but, first and foremost, the international community really has failed to uphold their responsibility to protect the people of Myanmar following the coup on February 1st, 2021. And that especially falls, I think, on the Security Council, the UN Security Council. I think about, what Myanmar's military, what the Tatmadaw most wants, and, what is what they want, and also what is allowing them to continue perpetrating atrocities across the country. And, I'm not the first person to, name the three things that they most want, but it's, it's money, it's weapons, it's arms, and it's legitimacy. Those are the three main things that they want. And it's those things that, access to those that allows them to continue perpetrating atrocities against their own people. Responding to the coup under R2P should really be addressing those three things. And you see it in a few different ways. So what should have happened, the Security Council should have imposed an arms embargo, for one thing, to limit the flow of weapons into Myanmar, because to really limit the military's ability to perpetrate atrocities against their own people. The special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Myanmar just put out a report, actually, on weapons transfers and the flow of weapons into Myanmar since 2018 and also since the coup. And he identifies 4 countries as having sold weapons to Myanmar since the coup, and that's China, Russia, Serbia, and India as the 4 countries that have sold weapons to Myanmar since the coup. And, obviously it goes without saying, Russia and China are both on the Security Council, members of the P5, with a veto. So they would be able to, if a resolution came up about, an arms embargo, they could very well, and it's likely that they would, veto that. But still talking about an arms embargo, and then I'll move on to something else in a minute. The United Kingdom on the Security Council is, what's called the pen holder. So they are the country that would table a resolution on Myanmar, and they haven't done that yet. They haven't, tried to, go to a vote on a resolution about Myanmar. And I think, it's definitely likely. It's almost certain that China and or Russia would veto a resolution on an arms embargo or anything else of that nature. But I think it's still really important for other, like-minded members of the Security Council to try. I mean, there's, really, I don't think there's any harm in trying to do what they can with, the tools that they have available. Despite the deadlock, despite the gridlock that is really plaguing the Security Council on Myanmar and on a host of other issues related to atrocities and related to other things. Tabling this resolution, even if it did fail, would send a signal to the people of Myanmar that the international community hasn't forgotten about them. And it would also clarify where everyone stands, because so far the Security Council has only met privately on Myanmar, which means, we don't really know. I mean, we can guess, we can kind of assume. And it is pretty clear where each country stands on Myanmar. But if, there was a vote on a resolution, that would really clarify, where each country falls when it comes to Myanmar. And it would force, and then it would, if it's clear that, nothing's going to happen at the Security Council, then if something were vetoed, then it would provide more of an impetus, I think, for action on more of a bilateral capacity outside the Security Council, if it becomes clear that, the Security Council won't be able to do anything substantial, anything with teeth.
Yeah, so why do you think that is, that the UK has not taken a stand to be able to hold the countries accountable, and everything has been done in such privacy and lack of transparency a year into this?
I think a couple things. And, one, I think I want to preface this by saying, the United Kingdom is one of the biggest supporters of, such a champion of human rights, a champion of the responsibility to protect. And that goes for, a lot of countries. But, specifically, I'm not trying to, disparage what, the United Kingdom, because they do a lot, especially compared to other countries when it comes to human rights and when it comes to atrocity prevention. But, at the same time, I think specifically on this, I think part of it comes down to not wanting to risk a veto, because that could reflect poorly on the United Kingdom or on other countries. I still think that it's worth it. Obviously. There's also, some other things that I've heard, other concerns, is that, if there were a veto, then that could be interpreted by Myanmar's military as, tacit support for the military. So there are a lot of factors going into it, and this is just theorizing, of course. I can't. Those are, the likely reasons that the United Kingdom has been wary of, tabling a resolution such as, on this at the Security Council. But I still think it's worth risking the veto to both send a message to Myanmar's people that the international community, that the UN hasn't forgotten about them, and also to really clarify where everyone is on the subject of Myanmar at the Security Council.
What are your thoughts on the relationship between R2P and the formation of these PDFs across the country?
R2P is a political commitment. It's a political norm. It isn't it isn't a legal obligation. So if a country does not uphold the responsibility to protect, either, domestically or internationally, there aren't any consequences for that because they aren't legally bound to uphold it. So it really falls on them, on political will. It falls on their capacity to uphold the responsibility to protect. And I think that speaks back to when I was talking, a little bit ago about how following the coup, there was this unprecedented, call among protesters in Myanmar for the international community to uphold the responsibility to protect, and how that shows that R2P has really opened up to something that even the individual can call for and can work toward. And I think perhaps the formation of PDFs could be another example of that.
Right. Thanks for that. On your website, you issued a list of action points that you'd like to see implemented to resolve the ongoing crisis in Myanmar. This includes everything from a global arms embargo from the UN Security Council to the Tamada providing unfettered humanitarian access to, quote, universal jurisdiction being applied by the global community. I don't think that anyone reasonable would have any issue with any of these suggested actions. However, in Myanmar, there's this growing frustration that this just kind of ends up as more lists, more calls for action, more statements, and at the same time, nothing is currently happening while people are continuing to get arrested and killed every day. So for many in the country and advocates outside, it's really hard to read documents like this with any real hope anymore, to be honest. So what words would you have for those that are growing increasingly desperate and hopeless by this global failure that we're seeing?
I think that's a really good point, and thanks for bringing that up. I mean, I think first, I, of course, share those frustrations with the failure of the international community in general to respond effectively and substantially to the ongoing crisis in Myanmar. But of course, recognize that at the same time, as I sit here talking to you from my apartment in Washington, D.C., I'll never truly understand what it's like for protesters in Myanmar and for people experiencing, what they're experiencing on the ground. And I just want to note that, to recognize that as, that's the perspective that I'm, bringing here. I think though, even though the Security Council has manifestly failed to uphold the responsibility to protect, I think what still gives me hope is remembering that, the responsibility to protect it doesn't have any agency of its own. Do you know what I mean? It is a norm, but it isn't an actor. And so that means that it falls upon, the international community to uphold it and to take actions that uphold and institutionalize R2P. And what that means, I think, is that, R2P really will only ever be as good as the actors that implement it. And I think 1 year since the coup, I think it's become increasingly clear that, bilateral action in response to the ongoing atrocities in Myanmar is increasingly necessary and increasingly urgent. And I think one recent example of, increasing bilateral, bilateral response to the ongoing crisis is that the European Union recently, imposed a new slate of sanctions, and, that included sanctions against MOGE, the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, which is a state-backed, oil and gas company. And that goes back to, I promise I'll circle back to the point of the question, but that goes back to, one of the things that the military needs to continue perpetrating its crimes is access to funds, and sanctioning, the oil and gas sector, where the military gets a substantial amount of its funds, of revenue, to continue perpetrating these crimes. And by sanctioning the oil and gas sector, by sanctioning, MOGE, the European Union has, in this really important way, worked to limit the Myanmar military's access to funds and therefore its ability to perpetrate atrocities. And I think that was a really, really important development, because it shows that, or it's an example of enhanced bilateral response to the ongoing crisis in Myanmar in the absence of effective and substantial response from the Security Council. And also, which I haven't brought up yet, but I think it's really important to discuss as well, is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So in the absence of, effective and substantial response from these multilateral organizations, I'm hopeful that there is going to be increased bilateral response to the crisis. And I think just the recent example that I flagged of the European Union, and that recent slate of sanctions, I think that's an example of that. And that gives me hope. I know it's small. There are definitely far more bad days and steps backward than good days and steps forward. But I think that is, one positive development. And I think that that is something that, I think the, partner organizations that I work with will, continue to increasingly call for. Of course, we won't forget, we'll continue to call for action from the UN, from the Security Council, from ASEAN, from these multilateral organizations. But it's especially important now to work for that, or to push for that bilateral response. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And I have a follow-up question. It's actually not my follow-up question. This is a question coming from a member of my audience that fits in well here. The person asks, why even bother with R2P if it can't be used and applied effectively? And then added, this is a serious question. So they wanted to indicate this is not a rhetorical question. This is not a criticism. This is a serious question of what is even the purpose of talking or working towards R2P if it is just a theory and it's not able to be used or applied effectively, at least as far as we've seen over a year now.
Yeah. First, I do take that question very seriously. Well, I definitely think that this question is, I think it's a really serious question. And I think it's, a valid concern considering how poor the international community's response to the crisis in Myanmar has been over the past year. And I think first, my first point is, reiterating that, although R2P is imperfect, it really will only ever be as effective as practitioners make it. So, the faults really aren't, I don't think the faults are with the doctrine. They aren't faults with the norm. I think they're faults with the international communities, whether it's, the failure to uphold R2P as a function of unwillingness or lack of capacity to do so. So I think that's important to flag. I think what's also, really important to note is that, R2P is the cornerstone of atrocity prevention. It is an extremely important, political agenda in a way of atrocity prevention, and there isn't anything else, like it. So I guess even this might not be, a super satisfying response, but, when I think of, okay, if, R2P isn't effective, at least in the case of Myanmar, well, what else is there when it comes to atrocity prevention? And, that might not be the most, so I think that's also, important to keep in mind that, we don't need more institutions. We don't need more, norms. We don't need more, legal frameworks for this. R2P is, I think it really is essential still in responding to the ongoing atrocities in Myanmar, because as just another point is, what else is there to, there's this global R2P is it's a global commitment to respond to atrocity crimes, and without that global commitment, without that moral imperative to respond to atrocity crimes, what else is there? We still need it. If there isn't that global imperative, what else can, at least from my work, what else do I, it's so crucial in my advocacy work to point to the responsibility to protect, to remind countries that they made this commitment to uphold the responsibility to protect. They made this commitment to protect people, their own people, and all people from atrocity crimes. So if you can't point to this concrete principle, this concrete international norm, that then I struggle to think of what else really there is.
You talk about how R2P is only as good as the practitioners are able to follow it and able to respond. And of course, by practitioners, you're talking about the world actors, the organizations, UN, ASEAN, as well as powerful countries, regional countries, or powerful actors in the world. As far as NUG goes, or activists on the ground, is there anything that the national unity government can do to support or bring about or encourage R2P, or are they really helpless and just waiting, hopefully, that others will pick up the cause?
What I think is really important to note in, responding to this, I think of how, following the coup, Dr. Sasa, who is, is one example, who's currently the union minister of the Ministry of International Cooperation for the NUG, he, for one, evoked the responsibility to protect in urging the United Nations to respond to the crisis in Myanmar. And so I think that that's one example of what the National Unity Government, can and I think is doing, is, evoking that language. I mean, I think language is super important when it comes to the responsibility to protect. And I think using that R2P language, using that atrocity prevention language is crucial, because it, for one, and I think it's really important, is that it reminds the international community of this this commitment that they made. So I think that's one thing. And then I think it can also, evoking R2P in general terms, but then also, which, I think the NUG has also done, is being, specific in what particular tools of R2P they want the international community to employ. Like I said, with arms embargoes, with sanctions on oil and gas, with depriving the military of the legitimacy that it craves on the international stage. And I think the National Unity Government I think they're doing that. And I think that, even if it's not necessarily under the framework of, saying you should do this because, R2P says so, even if they aren't necessarily thinking about it in terms of R2P, it still falls under R2P. And I think that the same goes more broadly for, a lot of countries in whether it's policy or laws or things like that, that is, a way of upholding R2P, even if countries aren't necessarily thinking about it in those terms. So I think just to, note that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I
Okay.
guess I'm just reflecting on that. I guess, you referenced how Dr. Sasa has used the term R2P in talking to the UN and other talks he's given, and it would. I wonder if that's all he can do. I wonder if he simply can remind people about it, invoke the meaning and the purpose of it, but then ultimately it does fall back to somewhat of a helpless state, that if those words fall on deaf ears and they go unheeded, that perhaps there's nothing more to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's I understand that criticism. And, I definitely, I empathize with that criticism. And I think, we wrote about this in one publication, but, after, obviously after the coup, I've said this already, protesters were revoking R2P in massive numbers. At least, maybe this hasn't been reported in the media as much, maybe I just haven't seen it, but I haven't seen protesters in recent months evoking R2P, at least not in the scale that they did at the beginning of this crisis, in February and March and April. And I think that, tying back to your point on Dr. Sasa, I think that is in part because perhaps those, calls fell upon, the ears of an indifferent international community, or an international community that perhaps, not entirely indifferent. And I don't think it is entirely indifferent. I think, there are several countries, and I think of the Security Council, they aren't, they care very much, but, because of, perhaps a more accurate way of framing it is, those calls fell upon not an indifferent international community, but at least in the Security Council, a deadlocked or, a gridlocked Security Council. But in terms of, what other things, beyond just, calling for, R2P, I mean, to a certain degree, I guess, a lot of what, the work that we do is, at the Global Center, it's, working with, states, in a lot of, behind the scenes advocacy to work with them and to encourage, certain responses to ongoing atrocities. And obviously those responses fall under, the norm of R2P. But, the Global Center isn't, we don't have the capacity either to, a lot of people say, invoking R2P by, for instance, sending in peacekeepers. We obviously don't have that, capacity as an NGO. Don't think we should disparage the value of, the NUG, evoking, calling for, the international community to uphold the responsibility to protect both, publicly in public statements and things like that, but also in those, behind the scenes private meetings and private conversations. I think I really do think that goes a long way. I really do think that is effective.
Right. And you had mentioned how you haven't seen so many R2P signs or calls for R2P lately as you did at the beginning, which I think is very true. And I think this also shows us the narrative and the movement of what the protests have done and where they've gone. I think this also connects back to that relationship between R2P and the PDF groups that is still trying to be defined and understood. And I think that among Burmese activists, there was this call and this plea for R2P or support of any kind, and for whatever reason, whether it was indifference, whether it was gridlock, short attention span, domestic problem somewhere else, whatever the reason was, because there was no R2P that was coming, there was a realization in the country that it would be foolish to continue to hope for support from any other body, and that they needed to rely on themselves. And because they were facing a foe that only spoke one language, and that language was violence and aggression, that this is the only language they could speak back in order to protect their lives and their rights and everything else. And so I think that there's a direct inverse proportion between the activists claiming R2P and pleading for R2P, and on the other hand, the formation of the PDF groups. I think the formation of the PDF groups can be, when many years from now the history of this whole thing is told, I think that it'll show pretty conclusively that those PDF groups were started to take shape as the hope for R2P started to fade away. And as people started to realize no one is going to save us, then there started to be an exploration of how do we save ourselves. And that led to what we see now, which some are calling an impending civil war. So I don't know where, there's no real good answers here. There's not even really any good questions. This is just characterizing how things have been and where we're at. And I suppose the one way to look at this, or one thing to ask, is, does this mean the ship for R2P in Myanmar has sailed? Are we past that point? Most of, I think, the fact, as you noted, that calls for R2P are no longer coming out of Myanmar in any real sizable way, as it was before. As you've noted in your letters, you have pictures on your website, you referenced in this talk, that individuals and organizations within Myanmar were referencing it, maybe really for one of the first time that it came in the public vernacular of expressing and calling for this. And that is now dropped, referenced in the question that I asked a moment ago, why someone in the country asking, why bother with even talking about R2P if it can't be used and applied effectively? And so if there's been this kind of turn inside the country that has felt like there's no one coming to our aid, R2P is not going to manifest, we need to find those resources ourselves. Not to say that if suddenly R2P were to come, that it wouldn't be welcomed open arms with many people in the country, but that at least the hope of it, the expectation of it, that's left the barn. So I wonder what you think of that, and from your standpoint, where you're still advocating and working for R2P in DC, what you think the prospects or possibilities of that are.
No, I think that's really great analysis. I think, first and foremost, it saddens me, a great deal to, think about that, those calls for the responsibility to protect really went, unanswered by the international community in an effective and substantial way. And I think perhaps, perhaps the way that I think about it in terms of, this inverse relationship, I don't know. I think it is, as, protests were, ongoing and gaining, momentum, as, the international community just, failed to do anything substantial. I agree with you. I do think that, that's when, you see, increase these PDFs, really starting to form across the country. And going back to your question of, is it still worthwhile? I think just to clarify, your question is, is it still worthwhile to, call for R2P, and, is hope of R2P lost? I don't think so. I think first of all, my first response to that is, I think if we abandon R2P, if we abandon the responsibility to protect when it comes to Myanmar, then I think that, I really do think that in some ways that would be letting the Tatmadaw win. And I think that abandoning, R2P would be a concession to the military. So beyond that, I think that might be more, symbolic, but more concretely, I don't, going back to, I mentioned recent EU sanctions. There have been a slate of sanctions recently from a number of different countries. That does fall under, that is an example of, the responsibility to protect. They might not be as effective as we would like them to be. They might not be on the specific industries we would like them to be, namely, of course, oil, gas, timber, etc. But that is still, a manifestation of these countries upholding the responsibility to protect. I also think of, companies like, Chevron, and that recently, or not, I suppose it's a couple weeks ago now, but has withdrawn from Myanmar over, the human rights abuses there. I think that speaks to, the responsibility of, corporations to, really look at their role in all of this. And I think that, those recent developments of, more, oil and gas companies, international oil and gas companies withdrawing from the country, I think that is, a positive development as well. And I think that, in some ways, I think that does fall under, R2P as well. So we are still, I think, so I cite those examples as, in defense of, maintaining calls for R2P, because, we are seeing these instances, albeit small, albeit certainly insufficient and inadequate to effectively combat the junta. They're still there. And, there's still a response. And I think we need to, I think when it comes to R2P, a lot of times, I think a misconception about R2P is thinking only about it in terms of R2P meaning intervention of either peacekeepers or, boots on the ground intervention. That isn't a lot of times, that's not what, most of the times, I think, that's really not what R2P means. But when we don't see it in that way, we kind of think that means R2P has failed, because it's not, manifesting in the ways that we think it should, or the ways that, the only ways that we think it can. But I think that we do see R2P in those minor ways. And I think that, recognizing and perhaps applauding is too strong of a word, but I think I'll leave it at, recognizing those small steps, and as small successes in the response. If we only talk about, the response to, the crisis in Myanmar, but also the response to any, crisis, if you only talk about it in terms of, all of it as a failure, then I think that, that makes it harder to, move forward, because then it's kind of, a mentality of, well, what can we do? There's nothing we can do. When in fact there is a lot that you can do. And I think by, recognizing the small steps forward can be fodder for, bigger steps and more impactful steps and more impactful, decisions. And so I think that I think that, that's my way of saying that, or arguing, in favor of, the fact that there is still, I think there is 100%, still hope. And for, for R2P guiding, centrally guiding the international response to this crisis.
Yeah, thanks for that. I really appreciate that kind of nuanced view that's not looking in terms of failure or success and defining success mainly as UN or other boots on the ground that are actually engaged in fighting, and looking at these other aspects of where support can come and where what forms protection can take place. Mm-hmm. However, one thing I'm thinking is that this failure on the part of the international community, it's not only impacting lives in the present, but it's endangering so many more going forward. And I reference this because something you wrote was, quote, "The continued inaction on part of the UN Security Council, the world body tasked with maintaining international peace and security, has bolstered the confidence of the Myanmar military and has entrenched impunity," end quote. this is definitely something I've noticed as well during the course of the year. And what came to mind when I read your comment, and I've also thought this before, strangely enough, it was Trump's famous quip in the run up to the election when he remarked he could kill someone on Fifth Avenue, shoot them dead, and not lose support. And the connection I'm making with this is that there's a measure of impunity in being able to progress along a certain line where you just wonder what does one have to do to lose whatever support that is and lose that momentum that is propelling it forward. And that's what Trump himself was indicating, was that he had so much support he can shoot someone dead in Times Square and he wouldn't lose it. And people started to ask, well, what could actually what could Trump do that would be too far? So that's the question I'm wondering about the Burmese military. What can they do that is too far? What is a line beyond which they cannot pass? That is a bridge too far. And we saw this actually. This even in the early weeks of the protests, we started seeing signs that said really, really graphically and tragically, how many dead bodies will it take for the UN to send peacekeeping forces? That people were wondering. There was a terrible image of or just devastating image of an old man holding a sign saying that if my death is what it will take for action to come, kill me now and let me stop the senseless carnage that's going to come after. Just take me if that's going to do it. And so I wonder what in looking at R2P, and I understand the way we've defined R2P now, it's this gradation where there's different levels of different kinds of action, and I think you're pointing to a wider and more nuanced definition than how it's typically used in Myanmar, which was really some kind of intervention coming and saving them. But what in terms of that more the bolder definition of R2P, do you have any thought as to, knowing the international community better than I do, and probably better than many of the listeners, given your work in DC and your advocacy, do you have any idea or guess about what lines the Tatmadaw would ultimately cross that would eventually be too far, that it would propel a further action? I mean, we've seen them burn people alive. We've seen them bomb indiscriminately. We've seen them commit mass rape and torture. We've seen them target doctors and journalists and arrest with impunity. We've seen such an egregious series of acts, and those acts are getting ramped up and ramped up and ramped up. Is there a bridge that's too far that would propel the international community into a greater action concerning R2P?
I think that's really interesting analysis. I had not thought of, the connection with that Trump quote and the Tatmadaw. But, on first glance, I think that's pretty spot on. And, my first thought is, I don't know what the line is. I mean, I feel like the Tatmadaw has crossed every line, possible. I mean, I think of, two, main, big examples that I think of, specific attacks. I think of Thant Long and in Chin State. I think the last tally has been, 25 separate airstrikes. I think it might be more by now, but I think the number was 25 according to Myanmar Witness. And, I think of the Christmas Eve massacre where, I'll be honest, I don't recall the exact number, but where civilians, including children, including Save the Children staffers were, as you noted, they were, killed and burned. And, if that isn't what it takes to spur the international community to respond, then, what I think, I don't know what it would take, but I think that I think what it would take is, I think it's a matter of, when does this start to become more of a, regional or sadly, I do think that the line might be, when does this become something that impacts more than, when when it affects more than the people within Myanmar's borders. And I think that is, and I think that's extremely unfortunate that might be the line at this point. I would think the line, I mean, just for the record, I mean, I think the line should have been, I mean, like I said, I feel like they've crossed every line in the book at this point. If not, then if not now, then when? But I think, based on, the international community's response so far, I think it will be when, since we haven't crossed the line yet, I think the line must then be, when is this going to, start impacting, other countries more? And, we've seen, more, refugees fleeing over the border into India, more into Thailand, for instance. So, perhaps the line then, if it isn't all of the atrocities that the military has perpetrated so far, then, which, really it's only impacting, Myanmar's people, then I feel like the line must be, perhaps the line for the international community will be when it really starts to impact them. And I think that's really unfortunate that might be the mentality that the international community has adopted here. But, when it, as you said, Myanmar's on the brink of a civil war, and UN officials have been saying that as well, that Myanmar is on the brink of civil war. And, I think the numbers of internal displacement are, of course, increasing. I think the latest tallies are, over 440,000 people have been displaced since the coup. That's just since the coup. There are over 800,000 people internally displaced in Myanmar in general. And I think, as violence continues to escalate, there's a really great risk that this will turn into, in addition to what it is now, I think it will, it'll be an increasingly urgent refugee crisis. It's already a very urgent refugee crisis, but I think that as more, as more people, flee violence in Myanmar to other countries, then perhaps that would be the final straw for the international community. That's my guess. That's my analysis. But I think it's really unfortunate that, if that is the case, then I think it's unfortunate that, the international community would have, waited until it, the crisis really started to affect them and be, an inconvenience for them, that's when they decided to take more of a substantial, to have more of a substantial response. I hope that's not true. I hope that's not the case. But, based on the, lack of response so far, I feel like that would be perhaps the next line that the Tatmadaw could cross, that really impacts the international community more. But then I think that just broadly, the last thing I'll say before I wrap up on this point is, when it comes to atrocity prevention in general, prevention is always cheaper than, just from a purely looking at this, black and white, financial point of view. Prevention is always cheaper than response. But we're past that. We can work to prevent, further atrocities, and that's what that's what I'm trying to do. That's what other, human rights, advocates are trying to do. But, the international community, I mean, we're at the point of, it's at the point of response. I mean, it's past the point of prevention. Atrocities are ongoing. Obviously, we're, like I said, working to prevent further atrocities, but, prevention is, a cheaper option. It's an easier option than waiting for it to get to the point that it is now. I hope that's clear. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I want to turn back to United Nations again. You had referenced elsewhere that the UN Security Council has met 9 times since the coup, and it's issued 6 statements, but it's taken exactly 0 substantive actions. why do you think this is the case? We talked a bit before about why the UK is not having more transparency, and you gave some theories and why things are all behind closed doors and there's not a veto vote. This is a slightly different angle on that question, and looking at not why they're doing what they're doing openly or closed, or bringing things to action or not, but just looking at why there continues to be there are these meetings taking place, whether they're closed or open. There's statements that are coming out, but even there's not any kind of substantive action, even on a minimal level, even on the lowest basic level. We're talking about the third wave of COVID crashing through. We're talking about IDPs and refugees. We're talking about it spilling over into other countries, and on, that there hasn't even been a baseline of minimal action taken to any degree. So why do you think that is?
Okay. I mean, I think that's a great point. When you're looking at, what has the Security Council done so far? They've met privately and they've put out statements. And pretty tepid statements at that. And I guess I don't know if this might be similar to my previous response, but at least in terms of why hasn't the Security Council done anything more substantial? What they could do, like imposing an arms embargo or sanctions. Things with teeth. Like the stick type of responses that only the Security Council can do as an international body. I think it does come down to deadlock among Security Council members to do anything truly effective.
So let's turn our attention now to the UN's Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, also known as IIM. This was founded in 2018. Can you tell us more about this unit?
Yeah, I think it's important to start in 2017, actually, when the Human Rights Council established a fact-finding mission on Myanmar. So another investigative mechanism to look into human rights abuses in Myanmar. And then, they issued their report, and then it kind of essentially turned into, or was kind of replaced by the IIM in 2019. And the IIM is doing, really, I think they're doing really great work at, collecting and preserving evidence of, the human rights abuses that the Tatmadaw is perpetrating. They investigate abuses that have been that have been perpetrated since 2011. So since 2011 up until the present. So they're investigating ongoing crimes as well, which is really important that that there isn't like a temporal limit on their mandate going forward. The limit is back until 2011, but they are investigating crimes that the military has committed since the coup and is continuing to commit. And the IIM fits into I think it's good to think about it within the broader context of justice and accountability when it comes to Myanmar. And other noteworthy things, perhaps one of the most noteworthy other developments there is in 2019 when the Gambia filed an ICJ case, a case at the International Court of Justice against Myanmar for violating the 1948 Genocide Convention, for the genocide that the military committed against the Rohingya in 2017. And that is a very important case that's of course ongoing, with hearings actually taking place this week as we record this podcast at The Hague. But I think in terms of justice and accountability, the IIM is really important just for, like I said, collecting evidence of what what crimes has the military perpetrated, and that really helps for achieving accountability and for achieving justice. And I think the last thing that I want to note before I turn it back to you in terms of justice and accountability is that too is an integral part of the responsibility to protect, and it's a really important component of the work that we do at the Global Center is looking to champion justice and accountability, and that's for a few reasons. I mean, on the one hand, of course, victims and survivors, they deserve justice, they deserve reparations, they deserve to have their what happened to them, they deserve the atrocities to be cemented in a historical record through a trial, and more than that, trials and accountability mechanisms, which, to go back to your question, the double IMM of fits within these. Justice and accountability is a really important component of atrocity prevention. One atrocity risk is atrocities are more likely to happen where they've happened before. If you have a resurgence in violence, and a way to combat, or a way to prevent, prevention, a way to prevent a resurgence in violence and a return of atrocity crimes is through accountability. And one main reason there is because if perpetrators are held accountable, then they realize, oh, there are actually consequences if I commit these crimes. But there has been, as you referenced, there is entrenched impunity that the military continues to enjoy, and part of that, I think, is because these accountability mechanisms take a very long time, and it would have been great if they had been if they had started earlier, but they started when they started, and they're doing really important work now to hold the Tatmadaw and other people and other actors accountable for at least in terms of the ICJ case, the 2017 genocide against the Rohingya. But that could lay the groundwork for a broader accountability for everyone in Myanmar who has suffered suffered at the hands of the military.
Yeah, I'm glad you referenced that case because I've also read that the UN Human Rights Council's fact-finding mission, it concluded that Min Aung Hlaing should have been prosecuted for crimes against humanity, not just against Rohingya, but throughout Rakhine, Kachin, and Shan state.
Yes.
And that they concluded that, quote, he continues to harbor genocidal intent towards the Rohingya. So it strikes me that if this was the official findings in 2018 and nothing came of it, it does feel increasingly hopeless to await for any kind of response in 2022. Of course, this might be a case of an outsider who is looking for bold evidence of progress being taken place and of rights being wrong, and justice can work a slower, more nuanced way that those of us not in the inner loop can not necessarily have the patience or appreciation for. So I say that with that understanding as well. But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's a good point. I think I just want to highlight the significance of the ICJ case, again, as a really important step in working toward justice in that case. And I think the fact the Gambia, which is a pretty small country, is the country that brought this against Myanmar, really demonstrates that it doesn't matter what big the country is, or how much clout they have in the international system. But that really any country can work to ensure that other perpetrators of atrocity crimes are held accountable. I think that not all of the routes for justice have been explored fully. The case, the Security Council, I think, still should, one of the things that, another thing that we call for is for the Security Council to refer the situation to the ICC, for the ICC to hold, perpetrators accountable as well. But I think that, it isn't all, I think that there could be more done. But I think that we also should highlight, the positive developments as well. And I think one thing that I do want to highlight, again, in terms of, international justice, that, shows that there are being positive developments, and it's not all a complete failure, because it isn't all a complete failure, is, back in 2021, I think in the fall of 2021, Argentina's judiciary announced that they would be, under the principle of universal jurisdiction, announced that they would be opening a case against senior officials from Myanmar who are responsible for the Rohingya genocide. And it is those bold, that's bold. I think it's those bold moves, it's those creative moves for to achieve, to work toward, justice, that is, I think we, should, celebrate alongside, recognizing, other failures of the international community, because that is a really positive development against a backdrop of a lot of failures in terms of international justice, in addition to the many other facets of this crisis.
Right. You've written that the UN's IIMM, the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, has collected evidence that, quote, if substantiated, would amount to crimes against humanity, end quote. Mm-hmm. This is an extremely serious charge that could potentially tip the scales of the international response. But what is standing in the way of them being able to substantiate it?
Well, it's the fact that, the IIMM isn't, a body that can, it's not a court that can, prove, or that can officially say, crimes against humanity happened, or genocide happened, or war crimes happened. That's just not how it, kind of functions. It's an investigative mechanism. So that would fall upon, it falls upon a court to make that official determination. So whether it be the ICC or the ICJ, or under the principle of universal jurisdiction, a country like Argentina, to investigate that. So that's, I guess what's, kind of standing in the way is that's not, the function of the IIMM.
Right. And let's move on now to talking about ASEAN. This is the organization consisting of 10 Southeast Asian nations, and check in about their response, or their lack of response. Yeah. You wrote, quote, there are serious doubts regarding the effectiveness and commitment of ASEAN to address Myanmar's human rights and humanitarian catastrophe, end quote. For those of us following the Myanmar situation, I can safely say that this is very much stating the obvious. The question is there anything that can be done about it?
Well, just for background for listeners who might not, I guess, know, the main, or one of the main things that ASEAN has done in response to this crisis is, what's called the 5-point consensus. So, 5 stipulations for, that are, supposed to guide ASEAN's response to the crisis. They have not been implemented effectively at all, to state, and that's an understatement. And I think, just to contextualizing, ASEAN's overall inaction in response to this is, overall ASEAN is, as a body is, pretty silent and doesn't do much on, human rights abuses in any of its countries, any of its member states. I think, it's not, unique to Myanmar that, and it's unfortunate that's the reality. It's not unique to Myanmar that ASEAN has done so little in response. So I think, that context is, important to when it comes to, thinking about how ASEAN operates. In terms of what they have done, I think one of the main things, and I think it's, really important to highlight this, is, in their October summit, ASEAN blocked the military from sending a representative, instead, extending an invitation to a non-political representative. Myanmar ended up not sending anyone. And the same thing, the same circumstances for a February. It wasn't a summit; it was a retreat in Cambodia. Again, ASEAN, blocked the military from sending, a political representative, instead extending an invitation to a non-political representative. Again, Myanmar didn't send anyone. And, that's very small in the grand scheme of things. It's very, that's small. But what it does do is, it limits it prevents the military from, getting the legitimacy, getting back to that point of legitimacy. It is a small way of preventing the military from obtaining the international legitimacy that it really desperately wants. So that is one positive thing. I think that might be the main, positive thing that ASEAN has done. I hope they'll continue to do that. And I think more broadly, what else ASEAN could do is, I think that we won't really see, if history is any indicator, we won't see a response from ASEAN as an entity. We won't see, an organizational response more than, what we have seen, which, among other things, they've appointed, an ASEAN envoy to Myanmar to I guess kind of, could be, it's kind of comparable to the special envoy in Myanmar, the UN special envoy in Myanmar. They kind of operate, similarly. But I think beyond what ASEAN has done so far, I don't think we'll see much more organizational response from the body, because, historically the body has not, operated in that way. And again, that goes back to my point on, really, pushing more for, bilateral response in the absence of this, multilateral, engagement. And I think especially a more concerted, a more, urgent, substantial response from ASEAN member states would go a long way, because they are, obviously they're Myanmar's neighbors. They are, members of the same multilateral organization. And I think that would, a more effective, a more robust response from ASEAN member states on a bilateral capacity would send a really important message to the Tatmadaw, whether that be, that should include, arms embargoes, even though technically, it's those 4 countries that have sold arms to Myanmar since the coup. No member of ASEAN has an arms embargo on Myanmar, has imposed an arms embargo on Myanmar. And I think, even though I don't think they're selling, arms to Myanmar, just symbolically, that goes a long way. And I think the same could be said for, for ASEAN member states imposing, sanctions on those key industries. I think what goes a long way. And it goes even further because they are Myanmar's regional neighbors. I think that would be really, I think that's really important.
Right. So changing tracks a little bit, I want to read a question verbatim that a listener from Myanmar sent in and get your take on what this person is asking. They say, we can understand that UN forces are peacekeeping forces and do not have the capability to fully engage with Min Aung Hlaing's thugs as a frontal assault. However, will the UN force be able to come in as police to keep the stability once the PDF engages Min Aung Hlaing's thugs and frees the cities? Will UN forces be able to help the PDFs run POW camps and maintain civility? We believe we can fight and we can win the fight. We want the UN peacekeeping forces to join hands with us once we liberate the cities to maintain peace and stability. We will fight. Can you guys keep the peace?
Thank you. Well, I should have said this earlier, but I do want to thank everyone who did submit questions to the podcast. I really appreciate the engagement. On that particular point, I really don't know. My inclination would be I don't know if that would be a likely response from the Security Council, because the Security Council is, the body that can impose those measures. They're the body that decides whether, where to send peacekeepers and the, the extent of the mandate and all the details on that. And if the Security Council can't even meet publicly on Myanmar, I don't think they would. I think it's almost, and it's very unlikely that they would manage to send peacekeepers to Myanmar.
Right. Thanks for that. And I know these are sensitive topics and people writing and asking out of some desperation. Mm-hmm. And another kind of desperate request that we've heard, and maybe you can also break this down and explain it. We talked about arms embargoes and the arms that have been going to the military, and that you've mentioned 4 countries that have been guilty of selling arms to the Tamada even after the coup. There have been some from the country that have said, well, if no one will come to help us, if we're completely alone, if R2P is a principle and not something people will put into action. And I understand now that's not quite fair to say. There's smaller and more nuanced degrees of R2P taking place. They're talking about the bolder actions they'd like to see. But as the question goes, if we are on our own and we have to protect ourselves and resist, why can't the international community at least allow us to receive defensive equipment such as bulletproof vests or ways or medicine even that is able to get through, or even on a more bolder scale, weaponry. If there is no arms embargo and countries are openly selling weaponry to the Tamada, why can't the NUG or the PDFs or the EAOs, why can't they then, if they're left to defend themselves because no one's helping, can they at least get the mechanism to defend themselves? This is another question that I've heard repeatedly over the last few months. So how would you take that one on? How would you respond to that?
That's a tough question. I mean, I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that specifically, to be honest, but in terms of, I obviously understand where that question comes from. I completely understand, the logic and, the thinking that goes into that. And like you said, I completely, recognize and empathize with the fact that, so many of these questions are coming from a place of, pure desperation and frustration with an international community that has done so little in response. But in terms of the question of, I really don't. I'll be honest. I don't. It hasn't been. It hasn't been a topic that has come up in discussions with member states. I don't mean to. I don't want to sound like I'm shooting down these ideas. And I hope I hope it doesn't come across that way. But I don't know if that. I don't think that it would be reasonable. That states would think it would be reasonable to provide arms for one thing. I think humanitarian aid is another discussion entirely. I work with. We don't work. The Global Center doesn't work directly on the nuances of supplying humanitarian aid to different to conflict zones. But so again, I can't answer super in a super detailed way on that. But I do work with some other groups that do work on more on the humanitarian side of things, and part of the to state the obvious, a major hindrance is to getting humanitarian aid into Myanmar is the military and how difficult the military is obviously to work with, and the unwillingness to or perhaps maybe inflexibility is a better term to permit humanitarian aid and sufficient to permit sufficient humanitarian aid. I think of air a lot of times with airstrikes on cities. A lot of times that comes with blockades that prevents civilians from fleeing the city, and it also prevents humanitarian actors from entering and providing aid that that's desperately needed. So I think that is just to highlight I guess perhaps stating the obvious that I think that is the main block to providing sufficient humanitarian aid. But at the same time, I think of refugee camps in Bangladesh, refugee camps in Thailand, and since the coup, a lot of countries have withdrawn or reduced the aid that they provide to these camps. And I think that I think to put it simply, I think that's the wrong move. The state should continue to provide to help fund and provide resources and funds to help these to these refugee camps, especially conditions in these refugee camps, especially in Bangladesh, for instance, are terrible. Terrible conditions, and I think that again the international community could be doing much more to improve the conditions for refugees, especially considering how the flow of refugees is only going to increase for the foreseeable future, and I think more could be done to in preparation for that kind of inevitable result.
Right. Thanks for that. I have one final question here, and we've looked at the situation of R2P from a number of different angles, a number of different actors, and I want to end on looking at the view from the ground, from more normal people engaged in this and what they might do within the democracy movement or supporters of that. You've written, quote, "The previously frequent invocations of R2P have waned amongst Myanmar's protesters. perhaps because they fell upon seemingly indifferent ears.
Mm-hmm.
Norms don't maintain their international weight through rhetoric alone.
Mm-hmm.
R2P, like all international norms, has no independent volition or agency. It will not succeed because of its intellectual purity or fail because of faults in its academic design. The principle of R2P will only ever be as effective as practitioners make it.
Mm-hmm.
End quote. And I should say this is something you've also referenced in this talk today. You've referenced several times that it's only as effective as practitioners make it. Those practitioners we've looked at as being the international community, the different organizations of nations. And I'm wondering, is there anything that you think protesters on the ground or activists on the ground can do to make their voices heard or bring about R2P within Myanmar, or for that matter, those that are listening to this now that are not, don't necessarily have any power in their own life or influence, are simply listening to this with goodwill and well-wishing, either those on the ground in Myanmar or those allies on the ground outside of the country living in relative safety, but concerned about this. Is there anything that us little people can do to support this, or is it really just kind of waiting around for the big actors to get their act together?
No, I think that's a really important, question. I think, broadly, approaching this question broadly at first, when you're thinking about, conflict prevention and responding to conflict and atrocity prevention, it's so important to really center the voices of the people on the ground and to, center those experiences and listen to, what they want and what their concerns are. Because they're the ones who obviously are, experiencing the instability and the conflict and the violence and the atrocities, and they're the ones who will, be experiencing whatever the aftermath is of the international community's whatever, policies, countries impose, or, bodies impose, or whatever they don't impose and whatever they don't do. So it's really, I think, I want to, highlight how important it is to center those voices of, people on the ground and people who come from these communities, people on the ground, and also people from the diaspora who either perhaps fled, violence years ago, perhaps recently, perhaps they still have family members in Myanmar or in refugee camps. It's so important to really center those voices. And it's something that, the Global Center tries to do when it comes to Myanmar and, all the country situations that we work on. And, it's something that a lot of our, partner organizations really, try to emphasize as well. And I think, just going off of that, in some ways, when you think, I think the diaspora plays, an especially important role here for a couple of reasons. Obviously, people on the ground are, facing, a risk of atrocities that is only increasing. And there is danger in, speaking out, or say you're, gonna, being, for instance, the recent phenomenon of, citizens journalists, as, the military, really clamps down on press freedom. I mean, of course, immense courage in what, protesters and journalists and everyone is doing, in Myanmar, to thwart the Tatmadaw. But of course that comes with, risks. The diaspora, however, faces, less risks in speaking out. And, I think, and, calling for, action from the international community. And so I think it's, voices on the ground and, really, of course, centering, voices of affected people in general. But I think especially in the case of Myanmar, I think the diaspora plays, a really important role. And they have been, I don't mean to imply that, they haven't been, measuring up to that. They 1,000% have been, and they have been, the diaspora has, is very vocal and works, incredibly hard to spur, effective international response. And it's, humbling to witness it and to work with, both members of the diaspora and also people who are, still on the ground in Myanmar. It's a humbling experience to work with them, and, an honor to work with them. And I think, that's what is, if there's like one last, like a final, note to leave on, is really just to drive home how important it is for policymakers to listen to people who are, affected by this violence, whether they are on the ground or in the diaspora or, wherever they may be. Those are the perspectives that should be front and center. Those are the people that should be, in the room, whether it's, briefing the Security Council or briefing, whoever, those are the voices that need to be, amplified. And, I think that's one of the jobs that I, try to, do, and the Global Center tries to do is, being, a mechanism to amplify those voices and to, bridge the gap between, people on the ground, people who are affected by these, most affected by these crimes, to the people who can, the policymakers who can actually, do something about it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I really appreciate that. I appreciate the answer to this one and to the overall discussion. I think it's been quite informative, at least for me. I'm sure for many listeners, this is a really important topic, and the work that you're doing has never had a greater test case playing out in front of us in real time than Myanmar. So your work is right in the thick of it with everything. So I think information is power. It's important for all of us that care about this and that are affected to hear someone on the inside of one issue and better understand it from in more depth than just the major talking points that it's hit. So I really appreciate that, and thanks so much for coming on here and sharing your knowledge and your activism as well.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to come on your podcast and to speak about R2P and Myanmar. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Many listeners know that in addition to running these podcast episodes, we also run a nonprofit, Better Burma, which carries out humanitarian projects across Myanmar. While we regularly post about current needs and proposals from groups on the ground, we also handle emergency requests, often in matters that are quite literally life or death. When those urgent requests come in, we have no time to conduct targeted fundraisers, as these funds are often needed within hours. So please consider helping us maintain this emergency fund. We want to stress that literally any amount that you give allows us to respond more flexibly and effectively when disaster strikes. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go to support a wide range of humanitarian missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person, IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and much more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution for a specific activity or project you would like to support. Perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian aid work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org. That's BETTERBURMA.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit cards. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either the Insight Myanmar or Better Burma websites for specific links to those respective accounts, or email us at info@betterburma.org. If you'd like to give in another way, please contact us. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Yeah.